Hey, Ben here, 3dgladiator.com, and welcome to this first part of a glove modeling tutorial. Actually, we will do a lot more than just modeling a glove in ZBrush. I have planned to show you the entire process from concept sculpture to the final presentation of a fully textured glove model in Marmoset Toolbag. The first 10 minutes of this video will be about some settings that you can set in ZBrush before you start sculpting, and then I will show you how to create the concept model. I would already like to encourage you to leave a comment below this video. So let me know what you think. Am I too slow? Am I going too fast? Is it too repetitive? Is the video too long? Would you like me to focus more on the technical aspects of 3D modeling and not so much on the creative part? Or would you like to see more of the actual sculpting process? So leave a comment below this video and I will consider your feedback for the next part. Let's get started. Welcome in ZBrush. That's the glove concept model I was talking about in the introduction. So it's still far away from a finished sculpture, and I'm dealing here with a pretty low polygon count. The model consists of around 200,000 points at the moment. And this is already quite enough to introduce some of the finer details, but if I zoom in close, you can see that it's pretty much unfinished. But at the same time, this polygon count allows me also to make large adjustments in case I have to. So I can move the fingers around, I can change the composition or move volumes around and adjust or change the overall look of the glove. So in the next part of the tutorial, we will then, of course, take it from here and turn the concept sculpture into a polished glove model where I can start retopologizing the mesh, applying UVs, bring it to Substance Painter for texture painting, and eventually I will create some presentation renders in Marmoset Toolbag. But before that, of course, we have to create this base model, and that's what this part is all about. So I'm not gonna show you the entire process, as many of the steps are quite repetitive, and I'm also not gonna show you just a time-lapse video, but we will go through the most important steps one by one so you get a better understanding of what tools I use and how you can recreate similar results on your site. It took me around 3 to 4 hours to get to this point. So I started with a 3D primitive, actually just a box, and then I simply used a couple of tools to establish the fingers and some of the details. But I will show you how this works in a second. Before we start sculpting, I would like to show you some settings that I always adjust before I begin modeling in ZBrush. And you've probably already noticed that my user interface looks a little bit different than the default user interface. And this is something that I've already mentioned in a couple of videos before. It is because I've adjusted the user interface, mainly the colors and the position of some of the icons, and I've also built a custom menu at the bottom of the canvas here. And do not be intimidated by this, even if it looks a little bit different. All the tools I use here can be found in the corresponding palettes, so these are not special tools or something. They are also available in your version of ZBrush, and I will point out where they are located when I'm using them later on and when I switch between different tools here. So let me quickly start with some canvas settings first, and I go to the document palette here and I change the background color to a lighter gray, and I also always set the gradient range slider down to 0 to remove the gradient in the background, so that lets me distinguish the outlines of the model a little bit better. And when you do this, you can save the canvas as a startup document, so it is there every time you start ZBrush. Then there's another thing I would like to mention here, and this becomes obvious when I move the model in a position like so. Then you can see here that, let me quickly adjust the light a little bit, that the area around the palm or everything that's facing down becomes pretty dark, and this is because of the a previous shadow that can be found in the render tab. So there is a previous shadow applied to the model directly on the canvas, and you can adjust or change these settings in the render tab. And I usually set the object shadow length always to 0, and when I do this you can immediately see that the areas that are currently quite dark become lighter just a little bit, and then I also adjust the length and set the length to the lowest value possible, so this will be 16 in this case. And this is so important that I've even placed the 2 sliders above the canvas here, so the object shadow length and the intensity, and I adjust these sometimes also in combination with the position of the light. So I move this little point somewhere in the middle here, so the model is perfectly or evenly lit from all angles, and that makes it a little bit easier to work with, because areas are not in the shadows just by rotating the model around, and you get a good view on the shapes all the time. So this is something that's very important. And the cool thing here is that you can save the position of the light together with the document settings. So if you have adjusted the background color and removed the gradient and click on Save as Startup Document, ZBrush saves the document together with the position of the light. Then I also always work with the basic material. It is part of ZBrush already for a very long time, or since the beginning, and I do not use any of these matcap materials because they have some sort of shading already stored into them. So if I choose, for instance, the matcap gray material, which looks quite similar to the basic material, and then go to the light palette and start adjusting the light, you can see that pretty much nothing changes, and that's because the position of the highlights and the shadows are predefined by the material and can be only changed in the material palette under modifiers. And you could, for instance, change the depth values here, and that would change the shading or the position of the highlights. And I prefer to have a little bit more control, and for this reason I always work with the basic material, and the basic material perfectly reacts to the position of the light. So I can test shapes by adjusting the light, and I have a perfectly lit model again by moving the point somewhere in the middle here. Then I also disable quick save, and you can do this in the preference palette. If you go down to quick save and set the maximum duration slider to 600, this means that the next quick save gets performed in 600 minutes, which pretty much disables quick save at all. I prefer to save my 3D models as C tools, and you do this in the tool palette by clicking on Save As, and I have also set a shortcut key to this to make the saving process a little bit faster. Actually, there are 2 ways to do this. So the first one would be to assign a shortcut key to the Save As button in the tool palette, like so. But the downside of this method is that when I now press the shortcut key combination, I always get prompted with a window where I have to choose the location and the file name, and this means I have to press a few buttons, and that slows down the saving process. So there is another way to speed up saving a little bit, and this option can be found in the C plugin palette. If you go down to the Subtool Master subpalette and assign a shortcut key combination to the second button here, like so. And when you now press the shortcut key combination, ZBrush saves the C tool without any further notification. So you save it as a tool first, so it has a file name and a location, and from now on you save it as a C tool by simply pressing the shortcut key combination. Unfortunately, this does not work that well since version 2018 and 19, because when I, for instance, now press the shortcut key combination, ZBrush prompts me with this little warning message that for some reason parts of the mesh are still hidden, and it is best to save with all of the mesh visible. And this message pops up even if the entire model is visible. So if you click on OK, the tool still gets saved as a C tool, but of course you have to click OK first, and then you are good to go to continue sculpting. So if someone knows a solution to this, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Alright then, enough talking about settings, let's start sculpting. And to create a good model you need good reference material, and for this project I've decided for this model here. I found the product on AliExpress. That's a website similar to Amazon, so it's pretty much the Chinese Amazon. And I sometimes search for reference images there because I know that they have a lot of high resolution pictures of their products, and also pictures or images from different angles and of different variations, and this allows me to get a good understanding of the shapes of the object. And I use these reference images on a second screen, so I do not place any of them directly on the canvas, and I simply switch between different images to get an understanding of what the object looks like while I'm sculpting. Modeling gloves is very similar to modeling hands, and I would like to show you two tricks to create much more natural looking hands, or much more natural looking gloves in this case. So let me quickly switch over to a reference image of this beautiful sculpted hand here. And as you can see, of course 4 fingers are coming out of the middle section of the hand, but the middle finger forms a group together with the ring finger. And then we have a second group here that is created, or that is formed by the index finger, and a third group that is formed by the pinky. So 1, 2, and 3. And of course 3 shapes makes it a lot easier to create a nice composition and to create a nice balance between these elements. And by grouping the middle finger and the ring finger, we create also some space between the index finger and this group, and also some additional space between the group in the middle and the little pinky. And if the index finger, the middle finger, and the ring finger are pretty straight, you can also try to angle the pinky quite a bit to break up the composition and make the whole hand look a lot more natural. I haven't really done that for the glove model yet because I'm still dealing with the Dynamesh, and as you know, when pieces of a mesh are too close together on a Dynamesh and then you remesh the model, ZBrush combines the elements. So in this case, the ring finger would merge into the middle finger. That's of course not what I want, but at the end, so after retopologizing the model, I would probably position the fingers like so. So we have the group in the middle, and I've also already angled the pinky just a tad. The second thing I would like to point out is the arc that goes through the tips of the fingers and the knuckles. So if we look at the hand from the top, then you can see that there is a slight curvature that goes through the tips and also through the knuckles. And this is mainly because the palm of the hand and the back of the hand, they are both not flat. So if we look at the palm of the hand first, then you can see that we have a slight curvature here where the finger starts and the cavity gets a little bit deeper in the middle of the palm, and it turns into a convex shape around the wrist. And the same goes for the back of the hand. We have a slight curvature or a slight arc also here. And if you keep these two things in mind, so grouping the fingers and considering the slight curvature or the slight arc of the palm and the back of the hand, then you are already on a very good way to create a natural looking human hand, or a natural looking glove in this case. How you start modeling really doesn't matter. So for the concept mesh here, I started with a simple primitive, a box, and I adjusted the initialized settings a little bit, like so, before I turned the primitive into a polymesh 3D. And then I've simply enabled Dynamesh, and you can do this in the geometry tab here. I've set a custom menu for this, so let me quickly restore the custom user interface, and I activate Dynamesh from here, set the blur value to 0 and the resolution to something really low like 48, and then I Dynamesh the whole thing and start sculpting from here. So as I've already mentioned, it really doesn't matter. You can start with, let's say, C-spheres. You can import a base mesh from an external application as an OBJ or something, and then turn that mesh into a Dynamesh or add a couple of subdivision levels to it. You could also start with a piece of mesh that comes with ZBrush. So if I go to the insert mesh brush body parts, as far as I can remember, there should be something like a hand in there. And if I draw it to the model like so, and then split the unmasked parts into a separate subtool and isolate it. You could also start from here. This is actually a pretty good looking hand already with nice proportions, and you could simply turn this one into a Dynamesh. Let's give it a little bit more resolution, like 120, and remesh it again, and then you are already good to go from here and start adding volumes to the fingers and already introduce some details. I, for my part, prefer to start with a simple box, so I delete the subtool, switch back to the box, activate symmetry. Let's see where the floor is by hitting Shift P, and symmetry is probably activated on the wrong axis, so I deactivate the X-axis and activate the C-axis. That looks already a little bit better. Then I hide the floor again and simply draw some circular masks at the top here. Invert the mask, hit the W key to switch to the gizmo tool, and then I start dragging out the fingers like so. So the individual bones of the fingers. Then I do this one more time. Let's remesh the whole thing before we mask the caps of these cylinders. Invert the mask again, switch to the transpose tool, drag out the next row or set of bones, remesh it, and let's do this one last time. For the tips of the fingers. And as you can see, I already slightly angle them. Then I disable symmetry, draw a mask at the side here to introduce the thumb. And I do this the same way I did before for the fingers. And I simply move it out, rotate it a little bit. Then I remesh the whole thing to have some more geometry available so that I can continue moving out the second part of the thumb like so. And of course, you are a little bit faster if you don't start from here. So it makes sometimes also things easier if you have a base mesh or some sort of base mesh available where the shapes are a little bit more established, and it speeds up the process at the beginning, but then again at the end you still have to work out the shapes and the outlines so that you end up with a perfect model. Actually, at this stage everything looks pretty funny, and you are not sure if you are able to get it to a point where you can present it to the world. But I promise you, if you keep practicing this and if you keep establishing and elaborating the shapes, it will eventually turn into a very nice looking model. But of course it takes some time, and at this stage I always try to work as fast as I can to build everything that needs to be built, even if it does not look correct. It is important that things are at least where they should be, and then you can continue refining and adjusting things. So let's introduce the cavity of the palm here just a little bit, and as you can remember from before, I make sure that the cavity turns into a convex shape again around the wrist, And we have also a slight curvature at the back of the hand, like so. And I use the clay build-up brush with a very low intensity value to build up these shapes. And also make sure that perspective is on, so hit the P key on the keyboard, and it's already a good time to assign individual polygroups to the fingers, and you can do that simply by masking a finger, then hit Ctrl W on the keyboard. And if we take a look at the polyframe, you can see that the masked area disappears and gets replaced by a polygroup. And I repeat that for the other fingers and the thumb. That makes selecting things a little bit easier from now on. So the middle finger is usually the longest. Then comes the ring finger, that's slightly shorter. The pinky, of course, is the shortest of all 5. And I already start to angle it a little bit. So remember, we have a curvature that goes through the tips of the fingers and the knuckles. And I'm going to introduce the curvature next. But for now, let's make sure that the fingers have approximately correct size. And then also the index finger has to be a little bit shorter. Like so. I'm going to adjust the length and the shapes again and again when I'm adding details. But for now, only the basic volumes are important, and that's what I'm focusing on. So the same goes for the thumb here. And every time you run into areas where the mesh gets quite distorted, simply run Dynamesh again, and you can continue adding volumes or details. So that's basically what Dynamesh is good for. You don't have to worry about topology or mesh flow, and you can focus only on the creative part of sculpting. And this makes Dynamesh such a great tool. I do not use a lot of tools here. I switch mainly between the move brush and the smooth brush, of course, and the clay build-up brush with a low intensity value. And that's basically already it. We will make use of the inflate brush, the pinch brush, and the edge polish and the trim brush later on when we are working on fine details. But for now, only a set of 4 or 5 brushes together with a clip brush is already enough to work on basic shapes. And it's also important that you keep the fingers apart, because if the fingers are touching at this stage, then Dynamesh will combine parts of a mesh into one piece, and that's not what you want to do for the fingers. So keep them quite separated at this stage. And I also prefer to have the mesh on a quite low resolution level at this stage, so I do not have to deal with hundreds of thousands of polygons. So a very low polygon count of 10,000 at the moment is already good enough to work on the main shapes. Of course, you do not have to work on every finger individually here. You could, for instance, also copy or work on one finger first, and when you are happy with the shapes, simply copy it over and replace the other fingers. So that's something that helps you speed up the creation process. And it looks already quite okay. So I'm going to make them a lot thicker later on when I'm adding a little bit more resolution to the mesh, but for now this looks pretty much okay. And let's slightly reposition the thumb. And I try to bend it inwards just a tad. So I switch to the gizmo again and hit the Y key to activate the transpose line. And then let's see if we can rotate it inwards a little bit. Like so. And also let's move it or rotate it to the front. And remesh the whole thing. Yes, it looks already a little bit better. Keep in mind that it doesn't have to be perfect at this stage. So if we come close to something that looks like a human hand, Then that's probably already good enough to continue or to start adding details. And before I do this, I higher the Dynamesh resolution a little bit so I can remesh the whole model again. But before that, let's focus on our main shapes again a little bit. So, like I've already said, these things simply take time. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, and you get a little bit faster if you're creating the same type of models over and over again. But every time you have to create something new, it takes a while to find out how the forms are balanced and how everything plays together. So that's a natural process that simply takes a while. And it's also a back and forth process most of the time. So you are building shapes, and when you compare them with the already established shapes, then you start to see things that don't fit, and then you are able to adjust them so it slowly turns into a model that looks like the reference material you are using. And it also doesn't have to be an exact copy, of course, because we are not creating a version that has to be exactly the same as the original one. And there's always some room for interpretation and some artistic freedom to it. And sometimes it also helps if you start building lines or drawing lines with the damn standard brush to define the shapes a little bit better. And because we do not use symmetry, we can simply mirror the model and look at it from the other side. And that sometimes makes mistakes or weak parts of the model obvious, especially when you have worked on it for quite some time and you need a fresh view. Then it's sometimes a good idea to simply mirror the model to get an understanding what's going on. So I'm not happy with some of these shapes here. And the goal of this process is to reach a point where you feel safe to add or to start adding details. So that's what this procedure is usually all about. So it already starts to look like a hand. Maybe the pinky is still a little bit too long. Because when it's angled, it looks shorter than it actually is. And then we also make the index finger a little bit thicker. Like so, and give it some volume. At the bottom and at the top. So I constantly look at the reference image that I have on the second screen and try to get the shapes right. Let's try to reposition the thumb one more time. And remesh the whole thing. And when I do this now, you can see that I've already came too close for this level of resolution. So it's now probably already time to change the resolution slider and set it to a higher value like 84 or 88 for instance. And then I can remesh it without ZBrush connecting these parts of the mesh that are close together. And again, I'm still dealing with a very low resolution mesh here. It consists of only 32,000 points. And that still gives me the freedom to make large changes fast. So I'm gonna pause the video here and clean up some of these shapes before I start adding details. And I'm pretty sure that you get the idea by now how this works. And like I've already mentioned, it simply takes some time to establish these shapes. So see you in a second then with a slightly more polished base model where we will focus on the thumb area first and start adding some cloth details there. So this is what I came up with after another 15 minutes of work. And I'm still not that happy with the back of the hand. The area here between the index and the thumb looks a little bit strange, and but that's okay for now, because when we add details or secondary details in the next step, I'm gonna change a lot again. So I'm building details step by step, and then I also correct some areas that still are not that great. So the first thing I do here is I mirror the glove, and then we need a little bit more points to work with, and you can simply do this by increasing the resolution. Let's try 200 and remesh the whole thing, and that looks already quite okay. So I start with the thumb area here, and again I use only a small set of tools, mainly the move brush, the clay buildup brush with a low intensity value, the damp standard brush, the standard brush also with a quite low intensity value, then maybe also the polish brush and the trim brush, and the inflate brush from time to time. So, but that's basically it. That's all you need to know when it comes to the brushes that I use. So first, let's establish some of these secondary shapes here, and it's usually a good idea to draw in the main or the most important landmarks first to get an idea where these lines are and how they contribute to the rest of the model. So I'm probably already a little bit too straight here. And again, it's a process where you go back and forth quite a lot. And here it is also important to slow down a little bit. So at the very beginning, I've mentioned that it's a good idea to build the shapes as fast as you can. But now it is better to place the reference points a little bit more carefully. I have, of course, the lazy mouse enabled, and I've increased the radius a little bit. And I also use the lazy snap feature, set it to 20 at the bottom here. And that allows me to continue the line where I've left off without having these breaks in the line. So it is quite consistent and smooth all the time. And I usually also use the DEM standard the opposite way by clicking Alt and then drawing edges on the surface like so. And then I switch to the clay buildup brush and build the shapes behind the edge to make things stick out a little bit. So I use this method mainly to build shapes that lay on top of other shapes like so. And don't be afraid to go too far with the secondary details or make them stronger as they are on the reference image, because we are going to lose quite some details during this step again by remeshing the model from time to time. So Dynamesh tends to smooth things out quite a bit, even if the blur value is set to 0. Let's see if I can place another ridge in there. Like so. And I simply switch between different tools here all the time. You could also set shortcut keys for individual brushes, but as I have them at the bottom of the canvas, I can access them pretty quick. So I do not have set any shortcut keys for the brushes. And let's see, we can also already start introducing some of the folds that appear on the glove. To make this look less like a hand and more like fabric. And I do this with the standard brush. I haven't touched the alphas here, but there is a round alpha assigned to the standard brush. And I adjust the outlines of these folds here with the move brush. And again, don't be afraid to exaggerate things a little bit, because you will smooth them out later on again. And every time you run into areas where you need more points or more polygons to work with, simply run Dynamesh again. Then let's try to draw in some more lines here, some more reference points, like so. And these lines also help us to clean up the shapes a little bit more. So let's see if I can get this one right. And you can always adjust them later on with the move brush, so straighten them a little bit or adjust the curves. And also feel free to make adjustments on the primary shapes if you think that's necessary. So that's still totally fine at this stage. And as you can see, I'm switching between different areas here, so I do not focus on one area only. And this has the advantage that I can come back to an area with a fresh eye or fresh view. And for this reason, it's a good idea to work on all areas of the model simultaneously, so you don't get lost too much on one area. And I use the clay brush again to build up shapes. As you can see, it has a very low intensity level. And this allows me to brush over the surface a couple of times and slowly build up volume. then again smooth things out a little bit. So don't be afraid to exaggerate the secondary details, because we will lose many of the crisp edges again when we run Dynamesh, or let's say we have to elaborate them anyways in the next step when we separate parts of the model and work on these parts individually. Let's see if I can get this line right. And again, I'm constantly switching between different reference images. And it looks like the index finger is still a little bit too thin. So I mask it. We have polygroups assigned to the fingers. Then I invert the mask. And then I usually also hide the mask. So I do not delete it. I just hide it by hitting Control H on the keyboard. And that helps me to focus on the area without getting distracted of the dark mask. Let's make this guy a little bit thicker, like so. And again, don't leave important details for later. If you can already draw them in, then feel free to do so, even if they are not perfectly correct. That doesn't matter at all. It is important that they are there because they contribute to the look of the entire model. So build them or draw them in as quickly or as soon as you can to get a feeling for the overall shapes. Like so. And then there is another line below, or another patch. It's a little bit too tilted. Let's try something like this. And again, I use the damn standard brush by hitting the Alt key on the keyboard to draw in these edges, and then I use the clay build-up brush to build up volumes around the edge. Let's adjust the outline with the move brush again, like so. Then let's see, there is a badge stitched to this area. And I tried to build it up with the standard brush this time. And define the edges with the damn standard brush, like so. So let me quickly also hide the fingers here so we can see things a little bit better. And this badge actually goes over here, and Then it overlaps the stitch line a little bit, like so, and it ends somewhere around here. And it is probably also a little bit larger, so I move these lines to the back of the hand just a little bit, like so. And then I use the clay build-up brush again to apply some volume. And define the edges a little bit better with the move brush. So again, this is a back and forth process, and there's actually no real right or wrong in this case, because you can keep changing things if you think that they do not fit. That's still possible all the time. Let's make this reference line a little bit stronger by going over it again with the damn stand-up brush. And these seam lines help to identify certain areas of the model a little bit better. You don't have to work on every finger individually. You could, for instance, work on the middle finger or the ring finger and then simply copy it over to the other fingers and replace them by running Dynamesh. So this means that you would only have to finalize one finger and then use it for the other fingers too. So that would save some time, but I prefer to work on each finger individually here. So I'm not gonna do this. Again, this line is a little bit too high. And again, of course, you can simply mirror the entire mesh to get a fresh view on it. And it's similar to drawing 2D images. There it also helps a lot to flip the image from time to time to see things from a different perspective. And this of course applies to 3D models too. I think by now you have a pretty good idea how this works. So I'm not gonna show you the entire process here, but I will continue adding secondary details on all other parts of the model. And continue building the straps at the bottom. Try to get all elements in place. And again, there's no right or wrong at this stage. And if you feel that things need to be corrected, then feel free to do so. And for the strap here, you could also mask the area like so, and then simply invert the mask and use the transpose line or the transpose tools to bring out some of the shapes like so, and then simply run Dynamesh to clean these areas up or to add more points to these areas, so you can continue sculpting without dealing with distortions. And then when you have built volume, sometimes pretty simple to smooth things out by switching to the H polish brush, set the intensity value quite high, and then go over the surface to flatten things out like so. So we really need to take care of the outlines here. So you get an idea how this works. And I'm gonna pause the video here, and that's it for the first part. And in the next part we will clean some of the details and then break it up in several parts that will be placed on different subtool layers, so we can work on each of these parts individually and build a clean and well defined and well structured final model.